So we're going to continue with the Chesapeake Bay case study. Bill Dennison reviewed a broad perspective of the Chesapeake Bay, its characteristics and its management, to provide kind of a literacy for you all to think about further. What I'd like to do is to dive deep on a number of scientific controversies that have been played out over the years of understanding the problems of the Chesapeake Bay and its restoration. And I'm not going to cover all of these controversies in great depth. Obviously, I don't have time to do that. But when we meet virtually, we can answer your questions and discuss these in greater detail. So, first of all, I put this overview of the vital statistics of the Chesapeake Bay just to give you emphasize something that Bill brought up in his lecture, namely that the bay is large, long, and shallow, and therefore it has a fairly small volume compared to the size of its watershed and the amount of fresh water that runs off into it, making it very vulnerable to land-based dynamics and inputs. These statistics are important for the next lecture that we're going to talk about with respect to the Baltic Sea. So I'll be comparing some of these statistics with that of the Baltic. So today we're going to look at, as I said, picking up from the Chesapeake Literacy lecture, we're going to look at the challenge of tracking progress in bay restoration, particularly with respect to dealing with the eutrophication problem and the total maximum daily load challenge. And then we're going to look more deeply into several scientific controversies that have played out over the years. And they're listed here, ranging from striped bass moratorium to issues related to the eutrophication problem to oysters and agricultural management. So I think you understand that the Chesapeake Bay restoration is dependent on a series of agreements. The first one that was put in place in 1983, endorsed by the states in the region and the federal government, which basically just said, we're going to make the bay healthy again. In 1987, when the eutrophication problem was understood as a central concern, the 87 agreement had specific numerical targets about reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus loads and sediments loads into the bay. But they were generalized. They were based on the models and assumptions that we had at that point. And in the year 2000 agreement, which in the year 2000, the agreement, the challenge in the 87 agreement was supposed to conclude, was supposed to be achieved in the year 2000. It wasn't. So there was a new agreement, which was a very comprehensive agreement, included lots of things that we agreed to do. But in it, it did not have the numerical, specific numerical load reductions, but it said we're going to commit to those and as determined by the best scientific analysis that was completed a few years later. The 2000 agreement also said that if we're not successful in reaching these objectives by the year 2010, the parties, the jurisdictions, the states, agreed to enter into what was called the total maximum daily load requirement under the Clean Water Act, in which these load reductions would not simply be voluntary, but would be mandatory requirement of the states. And so in 2014, in implementation of that, a broader agreement, which has the details of how we're to achieve the TMDL, not only in terms of the aggregate load over a number of years, but also with milestones, two-year milestones. And the target in this case was set for 2025. So we go from a target that was originally set for the year 2000, and now we're still trying to achieve that same result, now by year 2025, and it's still daunting. So this requirement here that there will be a total maximum daily load, and we'll achieve that by the year, or at least put in place practices that will achieve that by the year 2025 is the important driver at this point. So the total maximum daily load is the amount of a pollutant that a body of water can receive while still meeting water quality standards. So We know what those standards are. We set those standards here, and basically what we're then trying to determine is how much load, what is the maximum load that the bay could receive of human inputs and still achieve those standards. So essentially, we're solving this by inverse solution to linked models, linked bay model, a bay model that's linked to a watershed model that has inputs into that model, in which those inputs have a number of assumptions and estimates involved rather than discrete actual measurements based on observations. So we now have been using this model to track our progress in achieving those load reductions. And you can see here a recent appraisal that we are here for nitrogen. Maybe the estimate is something like 30% reduction that we've achieved thus far, and we're headed toward a TMDL, which is a ways to go. We made progress, but this is a tough reductions yet to achieve. These models suggest we're very close to the phosphorus load reduction, the total maximum daily load for phosphorus. However, new science, as we'll see, suggested that phosphorus loads from agriculture due to soluble phosphorus leaving phosphorus-saturated soils is actually unaccounted in these estimates, and so we're probably going to reassign a higher load levels that we are actually seeing right now as this is reassessed. So I just put the admonition here by the famous statistician Box to remember all models are wrong because they can't be perfect estimates, but some are useful. So hopefully this is a useful model, but we should be humble to understand that it's not totally accurate. And as we can see, if we look at the load reductions estimated by the model by sector of sources, atmospheric, forest, septic, wastewater, urban, and agriculture, we can see that a large amount of the reductions have been achieved by reductions of atmospheric input. And actually, we have a pretty good understanding of at least the inputs, not necessarily how much of that enters the bay, because we've actually been able to measure changes in atmospheric deposition. And also, similarly, we have a good handle on wastewater load reductions because we know at the end of the pipe we can measure those changes in load reductions. The point is that the other sources are largely estimated based on assumptions of the effectiveness of various practices and estimated loadings from those assumptions downstream into the bay through the watershed. So what do the observations tell us? We have monitoring of nitrogen and phosphorus levels, sediment levels in the rivers that enter the bay. Of course, though, this is highly variable year to year, and so it's a somewhat confusing picture because of meteorological variability as much as anything. And you can see here a recent USGS analysis month by month in which the trend is estimated by a process that adjusts for the flow and also is a smoothing process to give us a smoother representation of the trends. And what we can see here is that the loads certainly overall in these rivers in the bay have decreased. This is for nitrogen from the rivers, except for the month of September. The decline is about 20%. If you reflect back to what the model is telling us, the model says we've achieved about a 30% reduction of nitrogen input. So one troubling issue here is this difference between what the models are suggesting and what the rivers are telling us. Is that due to some lag time, or is that become some other misestimate of what the trends really are? Or with the model, is the model wrong, or do we have misunderstood the observational data, or not included direct inputs and things like that in this assessment? Much of this reduction on nitrogen could actually be as a result of the reduced loading of deposition of nitrogen from the atmosphere onto the broad landscape. Some recent work by our colleague Keith Eshelman suggests that, at least for the Potomac Basin, this might be the case. Also, a recent observation shows us that the load reductions from the Susquehanna, there have been load reductions from the Susquehanna, but they've recently been reversed for phosphorus because the dam, the reservoir behind the dam is filled up and is no longer trapping particulate material, particularly particulate phosphorus, and that has to be dealt with. So the challenge we have going forward is how do we reconcile the differences between observed and model load reductions. So let's talk about some of these controversial issues. The first one is the striped bass moratorium. There was a decline, noticeable decline. People just were not able to catch many striped bass. Both recreational and commercial fishermen got to a crisis point so that Congress actually passed an act that mandated provided support for some research and investigations onto the topic. And the question in which this research had, was this due to a decline in pollution? There was a great concern about aluminum coming off of runoff into streams in the spawning areas of the striped bass as being a problem. Or was it simply due, not simply, but due to overfishing? The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission set limits, more restrictive limits, size and pound limits. And there was a controversy that ensued is that whether that was sufficient or whether the decline had been to the point where an outright moratorium was required. Maryland scientists, including those in UMCES, were advocates through their analysis to show that something as desperate as this was required. So Maryland took the lead and in 1985 imposed a total moratorium, sport and recreational and commercial fishing. Couldn't catch striped bass at all. Virginia followed 4 years later. So you can see here, this is Maryland data showing the young of the year, the young newly recruited striped bass estimates of their abundance, and you can see the decline that took place in the late 70s, and you can see the effect of the moratorium and the rebound of the population of recruits. And now, mind you, there are year-to-year variations, and some years still are very low, but the recruitment levels have been relatively high by historical standards. And now the resource is open again for both commercial and recreational fishing, but with more restrictive limits going forward. So a way that science came in and helped empower bold decisions by managers and resulted in the desired effect. Really, one of the lessons of global lessons of a better managed fishery, the benefits and recovery of a depleted fishery. So we all know that submerged aquatic vegetation has been reduced in the Chesapeake, and that's one of our objectives, why you want clearer water or you want less nutrients coming into the bay. But this was exactly the cause of this was actually quite controversial initially. Here, these are estimates of the abundance of submerged plants in the upper bay, the Maryland part of the bay, over the years, and you can see how the decline was quite precipitous, and particularly corresponded with this tropical storm Agnes that really knocked the grass beds pretty hard. And their recovery has been very slow, and so this is where we're struggling to improve the acreage, the area covered by submerged aquatic vegetation. Now, it was thought that by some scientists that this cause was the reduction was really related to the advent and the use expansion of the use of herbicides in agriculture. Obviously, herbicides are there to kill plants, and so the runoff of these herbicides that we could measure was seen as a culprit. Others thought it was the sediment input from the rivers that had increased and made the water cloudy. But this research, led by Michael Kemp and company, really demonstrated the role of nutrient over-enrichment, here showing experiments in ponds at Horn Point, which showed with various levels of loading of nutrients, nitrogen, and particularly in this case, we can see how the system shifted from a submerged rooted plant system to one in which there were in control to one in which there was a higher growth of phytoplankton that shaded the grasses and overgrowth of epiphytes. and that gets worse to the point where the grasses, the SAV is reduced greatly at the benefit of plankton, phytoplankton, and epiphytes. So this helped then set some of the requirements for what water quality was needed to bring these grasses back. That served as the basis of determining this TMDL, the water quality standards in the TMDL. Fast forward, now there's a recent resurgence in interest and concern about atrazine, the one of the principal herbicides that is used, but not so much in terms of what it does to the SAV, but as an endocrine disruptor to animal life living in the tidal waters of the bay. So one of the challenges that face the bay, because it is an estuary with a range of salinity conditions, is the dominant paradigm when these issues of nutrient over-enrichment rose up was that, like the Great Lakes, like a lot of freshwater environments, and even like the freshwater tidal Potomac below Washington, where improvements were seen by controlling just phosphorus from wastewater treatment and so on and the like, that when coastal scientists began to raise the concern that nitrogen was also a factor, it was resisted by the managers in the political community as too costly, unproven. And it really was a combination of mesocosm studies, field bioassays, mesocosm studies done by Chris Delia, who was at CBL at the time, Tom Fisher in his field bioassays, and other lines of evidence which really showed that the bay, if you look at the estuary from the freshwater end member to the ocean, and here's over the year, the bay starts out early in the year as being phosphorus limited, the phytoplankton growth and production, whereas it then becomes nitrogen limited over much of the bay during the summer and fall. So it really requires a two-nutrient reduction strategy. And then in addition to that, if we look at, this is Tom Fisher's work, what the effect of management at that time, interventions could do, further wastewater reductions and agricultural reductions wouldn't have reduced the loading. This is for the chop tank of phosphorus very much, but were particularly could be effective, particularly with respect to agricultural fertilizer applications. Could greatly reduce the loading. So nitrogen became a bigger focus. So in the 90s, there was a widely publicized set of findings by Joanne Burkholder, a scientist at North Carolina State, that there were these dinoflagellates that were very complex life history that were enhanced by eutrophication and degradation of estuarine systems, and they would occasionally explode. The populations would explode. And these animals, these organisms, these dinoflagellates, would kill fish and also produce a toxin, which, among its other effects, would cause a memory loss. So this had resulted in a considerable controversy down in North Carolina that we're all watching. And then in 1997, there was a big extended series of fish kills in the Pocomoke River in the lower shore and associated human illness, including reputed memory loss, that draw a lot of attention in a very rapid and very short period of time. The governor and other forces at the time said we need to do something about this. Seafood sales plummeted, even though this organism is not it's not a kind of an organism that causes illness related to eating seafood. And so as a result of that, I was asked to put together by a former governor who was serving as the chair of a commission to figure out what to do about this, Governor Hughes. He said, "Don, can't you bring the scientists together to develop some consensus?" I explained that there was controversy, there's a lot of unknowns, and he said, "But I have to make a recommendation." So I brought this group together here at Horn Point, at the Center Administration Building, actually, And there were scientists who were skeptical. There were scientists who were advocates, including Dr. Burkholder, and other scientists who kind of understood the broader issue of agriculture and of eutrophication. And so what we concluded was that not that it was definitely Pfiesteria, but that by reducing nutrient loads, you could reduce the risk of harmful algal blooms such as that. It's a possibility that you could. So as a result of that, in short order, the General Assembly passed the Water Quality Improvement Act of 1998, which required agricultural nutrient management in farms of a certain size and larger. Subsequent research by Al Place at IMET has suggested that the actual culprit in this case, and more common culprit for toxic dinoflagellate blooms in the bay, is another species of dinoflagellate called Carlodinium. So we don't have the cell from hell, but we have, as Al says, a little dino with a big bite. So back in a administration of Governor Ehrlich, another Republican governor who wanted to do something to help the watermen and take bold action to improve the bay, they became very interested in dealing with this problem of the decline of the oyster industry by introducing a non-native oyster, an oyster from Asia called Austria ariecensis, which had been shown to grow well under these conditions. And so the view is that we could get to the point where we were producing large quantities of this from the hatchery that were soon to be built at Horn Point, that we would be building at Horn Point, and therefore repopulate the bay with this non-native super oyster. Seeing the risk, I and others said we need to slow this process down a little bit, and I convinced some of the powers that be that a National Academy of Sciences study would be appropriate. It would take a period of time and probably have a balanced, moderate view, and indeed it did. This is the report. And so what this committee recommended is to continue not to prohibit introduction or not to introduce reproductive diploid animals, but to continue with aquaculture of sterile triploids while assessing the risk. And you can see the risks that are outlined here, as well as this committee did a very good job of putting some myths to rest. The myths here showing on the right side of the screen. So I mentioned earlier this phosphorus problem, that we found that in areas where there was a high level of soil phosphorus that resulted from repeated manure application, usually to satisfy the nitrogen requirements of the crop while applying too much phosphorus for the crop, more phosphorus than the crops needed year after year. But it had been thought that phosphorus was particle reactive and it was bound to the soil. But research showed that soluble phosphorus loss occurred after saturation, as summarized in this figure here. So a new approach to manage that risk determined which fields were susceptible to the loss and which needed a more restrictive application of manure and other fertilizers was developed. It's called the phosphorus management tool. It was developed by the ag science community, but the ag community, the agricultural community, resisted it to the point where they kind of backed off and we were at an impasse. Governor O'Malley at the time wanted to thought we should move forward with this, and yet we were hard to get everyone comfortably to agree to a consensus. So he asked me and two other scientists who were advisors in the Baystat process that I think we mentioned about to give him a clear answer about why we needed this tool. And so this is a wonderful example about if I alone or with some other environmental scientists produced this, it would have been dismissed out of hand. But this simple 3 or 4 page document had power because it had an environmental scientist and 2 ag scientists basically with a consensus statement on this, on why we need the phosphorus management tool. A good case where an epistemic community, if you will, of scientists across their traditional boundaries of advocacy and interest had power. So finally, this is one that's active as we speak. This is the issue of oyster sanctuaries. It's been in the news just recently. And it started out when Governor O'Malley appointed a Oyster Advisory Commission that produced recommendations in 2008 that said we needed a new approach to this that promotes aquaculture, promotes restoration, not just wild harvest. The plan was put in place in 2009, which we had designated for the first time some very large areas of sanctuaries that would have no harvest and that we'd do restoration activities in. When Governor Hogan was elected, with a lot of support from watermen in rural parts of the state, he committed to reassess the plan, and he then just last year changed the composition of the Oyster Advisory Commission, which quite frankly O'Malley had stacked more into the conservation science end, and now the commission is half or more of them are associated with watermen or harvest interest. So it presents a really interesting dynamic that we're dealing with. He also halted the restoration, on behest of the watermen, he also halted the restoration activities in the Tread Avon Sanctuary near here on the eastern shore. So we're now struggling through this with this new this new Oyster Advisory Commission. So the scientific questions before us are these sanctuaries in restoration working? There was a 5-year review of the sanctuaries by the Department of Natural Resources, so some of them are working well in terms of building biomass and spawning potential. There's also a review of the Harris Creek Sanctuary, which showed, again, that they were meeting the requirements. So we've been past that with some difficulty, I should say. And now we're looking to determine where the best locations for 2 additional sanctuaries should be in the lower bay, probably, the lower Maryland Bay. And how should well-performing sanctuaries be converted to rotational harvest areas? This is something the watermen want. And what are the risks of reducing sanctuaries? We had an initial concept that between 20 and 30% of the productive bottom should be in sanctuaries. We're now at 24. We have a proposal from the government to reduce it to 21. Is this an acceptable or unacceptable risk? And then finally, we've been asked by the General Assembly to determine what is a sustainable harvest level. It's done for fish populations regularly. We don't have a sustainability estimate for oysters. And so there's very likely, if we can get everything in place and the funding established, an estimate to estimate the sustainable harvest level that will play into this, because the General Assembly now, in a response to the actions of the Hogan administration, basically has a bill that's considering is that we don't change anything in terms of sanctuaries until we have this sustainable harvest estimate completed. Stay tuned. Thank you.